among the candidates, it's pretty hard to predict how this is going to shake out. But at this point, we're seeing more Democrats voting than unaffiliateds or Republicans, which makes sense in a city like Denver. But we'll see if there are surges in some of the geographies that overlaid with some of the candidates' successes in the general. Kevin Beatty from Denverite and CPR did a great map where he showed sort of where the candidates had the most support from. So I'm kind of looking at that and going to overlay it with the return data as we roll on here.
Thank you for that, Ian. Before we go to Alan, I would just want to quickly introduce Steve Welchert. Steve is also joining us this morning. Steve, of course, is a veteran consultant and one of the most successful public affairs practitioners in the state. Steve has worked on hundreds of campaigns in more than a dozen states, including campaigns for Roy Romer, Mark Udall, Ed Perlmutter, Federico Pena, Tom Strickland, Mike Freely, and of course the presidential campaign for Barack Obama. He also worked as legislative liaison for Colorado Governor Richard Lamb, and then served Denver Mayor Federico Pena as issues director and also as the candidates debate coach. Steve, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Luigi.
Steve, I was asking everybody what the state of the race where we're at this point. We already have you, so why don't you go ahead, sir, and jump in?
I think the race is pretty well cooked, actually. You see the candidates now with their final ad push. Still a little negativity out there, interestingly enough. I got a piece of mail from the Johnston campaign on Kelly's oil and gas record. And I'm one of those guys, Ian, who doesn't return his ballot. I hold mine to the very last minute so I can get the last piece of mail and the last digital ads. I want to see what the campaigns are doing. But I think most voters are probably pretty well aware of what's going on. And I think it's been a pretty good campaign, and not quite as rough and tumble as some would have expected. I suspect that's because we have two candidates that are more alike than not. But I think the campaign overall is relatively well baked at this point.
Thank you. I'm like you, Steve. I hold on to my mail ballot so I can see all the campaign mailers coming my way. Alan, go ahead, sir. What do you think? Where are we at in this race?
Well, truth in advertising, my focus has been on the transition, and so I'm not aware of polling. I watch the race kind of through newspapers and catch it. I'm not really focused on the politics of the race. I'm more focused on turning over the keys to, I think, two very capable people. I can't improve on what Steve just said. The race is probably baked. People have an impression. I don't know what could happen in the last few days to turn people in a different direction. I suppose it's possible. But my guess is it's going to be close. And I think I'm more interested in what the turnout will be in 2011, the last time we had a competitive race. The first round, I think there were about 113,000 people, and there were 8,000 added in the second round. If you take that same kind of number for this time, let's say you add another 9,000, you could be looking at about 181,000 people voting. And so what's the win number on that? About 91,000, which is what Mayor Hancock got in his reelection in 2019. So high voter interest, and it will be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Thank you, Alan. Mike, what about you, sir? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll make a bold prediction. I think Kelly or Mike will win the race here next week, in about a week from today now. So how's that, Luigi, for
that's very good
prognostication?
That's very insightful. Yes.
Here's my take on it. I think I think this is a problem-solving election and not a vision casting election. And that's the lens I look at all of this through. And as Steve said, you have two candidates that bring a lot of similarity to the race, both reasonably centrist, reasonably moderate candidates. However, both keenly aware, obviously, that they need to do a lot of outreach and a lot of messaging on many of the progressive issues that are important to Denver voters. And it seems like to me, I'd be interested in some of these other guys' takes who have been around Denver for a very long time, particularly you, Steve. But the electorate seems to be a little bit grumpy. I think they want to see some problems get solved, but they but based on the way the candidates are positioning themselves on the messages, they don't seem to want real reactionary policies. That's my take, and it looks like it's probably going to be one within just a few points. It would be my take.
Mike, just really quickly, when you say it's a problem-solving election vis-a-vis a vision casting election, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I just think that the issues that are front and center in a lot of voters' minds come up every single debate you watch. Every time you hear either of the candidates talk about these issues, they're obviously privy to a lot of polling that I'm not privy to, although I've seen polling on different issues, and it's homelessness, it's cost of housing, and it's crime. And those are issues that people obviously want to have solved. It's a little bit different. That there seems to be a sense, in my opinion, that our great city needs sort of a look inward. We need to get some medicine on board and fix some of these issues, and then we can kind of relaunch into more of the visionary kinds of things that we've seen, other mayors have the good fortune to do in the past, including our current mayor.
Thank you, Mike. Ernest, what about you? What are you seeing?
Well, I think everyone's describing it correctly. One thing that's interesting is this is the first runoff election that has occurred so much longer after the general election. I believe it's 11 weeks. Is that right? It was a very fast turnaround in all the previous runoffs. And I've heard some people say that could be one reason that this mayoral runoff doesn't seem to be dominating things the way that previous ones have, is everyone kind of had a chance to relax and sit back on their elbows and kind of forgot there was an election happening for a few weeks. And then the campaigns and their independent expenditure groups have started pouring it on since then. But I've heard that from a number of folks is they don't have the sense that it's an active, engaged campaign, the same that some previous ones are. I wonder if some of that is because the candidates are more alike than they're different. They're offering competing views that are not that different. And
I think you're onto something, Ernest. I hadn't really thought about it much, but for about a month after the first election, it was dormant, right? There was nothing going on. Part of that reason is because both candidates spent themselves down to zero to get into the runoff. And so you had to kind of replenish and refurbish and kind of reset your campaign. But and you're right, in past campaigns, it's been a flurry. It's been just a whirlwind of, you got 6 weeks to go figure it out. And people really scrambled hard to get that last campaign done. Here it's been a little different pace, and I think you're exactly right. There's a couple of reasons for it, but money's one of them. The other one was you can't really sustain that level of activity that long, right? So,
good point.
Yeah, that part's true too. I mean, in terms of like campaign advertising, you want to make sure that you're blitzing when people are actually making their decisions. And since voter turnout is still at 12% right now, if you're up on TV in the last week and you're just sustaining until election day, that's probably a good allocation of resources versus trying to spread out your points way too thin over the course of 6 weeks or 2 months. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Both of these candidates have raised a lot of money. Fair Election Fund has given them extra, and then they both have pretty robust independent expenditure committees. But it isn't wall to wall like it is just in the 2022 general election, for instance, where Denver Broadcast in the US Senate race and even in 2 of the congressional races were kind of just dominating the airwaves completely. This is quite a bit sleepier and affair, despite TV being cheaper now than it was in 2022, and despite the IEs having, several $1 million in their war chests.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of key off of something that Mike mentioned, and that is what might be motivating voters and concerning voters. And I think he touched on the top 3 issues: unsheltered homelessness, concern about public safety, and affordable housing. I think this is a problem, frankly, for cities across the country post-COVID recovery, opioid epidemic, rising crime, challenges with unsheltered homelessness. What I'm mostly struck by, and I don't mean to be controversial, is that while both candidates, I think, operate from the center and are pragmatic people, their messaging around these issues is not significantly different, frankly, from what the current incumbent mayor is offering. So I understand the need to create a vision that things are going to improve overnight. My prediction is things are not going to improve overnight. It will take incremental change, and frankly, not very different from what the city's doing right now. I'm not really seeing major changes in programs. I think we're seeing candidates who will pick up the mantle and use programs that are already in place. And my hope is that that these changes will take place sooner than not. But my prediction is that this is going to be a slow crawl as cities are experiencing around the country, particularly with the drag of the opioid epidemic and a lot of sick people on the street that is contributing to the unsheltered homelessness. And you can see it in San Francisco, you see it in Portland, you see it in Austin, you see it in Houston, you see it in every major city in the country.
Right. Can I ask a follow-up question here? Which candidate has a lock on which various voter groups? This is a nonpartisan election in a heavily Democratic city. Both candidates are registered Democrats, and both are getting some support from across the spectrum. But in general, it looks like Mike Johnston is pulling more from the progressive side. He's got endorsements from Lisa Calderon, who came in third in the first round, State Rep Leslie Herod, State Senator Julie Gonzalez. Others, while Kelly Brough has the police and firefighters unions, Pete Coors from out there in Golden, and the Denver Republican Party as among her most prominent backers. Now, how's that all shaking out in a nonpartisan election here? What do y'all think? Why don't we start with Steve?
Wow, that's a big one, Ernest. Alan and I had this conversation a few days ago when the Republican Party endorsement came out for Kelly. I just thought that was a pretty big noose around her neck. Today's Republican Party is branded as the party of Trump and the party that killed Roe. And that's not a team you want to be on if you're running for office in Denver, Colorado. But I think at the end of the day, those kind of labels don't really matter as much in a Denver mayoral race. Mike had it right. It's a pragmatic race. It's who can get stuff done. And my friend Alan may not be wrong, but there will not be much of a honeymoon here for either one of these people for mayor. If they're not moving the meter much faster in a year, there'll be pitchforks out. People will be coming after these folks. They will not last long. And that's the real reality of it. They can, you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose, right? And they're going to have to govern with their sleeves up and get after it really fast. And I had a chance to start watching the FDR piece this last weekend, and that 100-day piece is unfair to the rest of us as politicians, but they got 100 days to really get after things and make it happen.
Okay. Ian?
You're running for mayor of Denver and you get the Denver Republican Party's endorsement. If you don't run away screaming from that thing, throw it on the ground and say, we don't want that, I think you're making mistakes. I didn't see that happen. So I thought that was very strange to try and cobble together a winning coalition with like 20% of the city who doesn't really vote as hard as the Democrats and unaffiliated. Seemed like an odd choice to me. But you're right. I mean, that's where the battle lines break down. I think you could say safely, the progressive candidates and the center left candidates kind of rallied behind Johnston in various phases after the initial round, after the general. And then, Joe Coors or Pete Coors, Republican funders and donors and Republican parties all lined up behind Kelly Brough. I mean, that should tell you something. It's not a coincidence. They agree with her and they think she'd be a better mayor for Denver than Mike Johnston, whereas the progressive candidates probably think Johnston would be a better mayor, or at least it seems that way. So you're in a city that votes overwhelmingly for Democrats and you're getting all the progressive and Democratic endorsements. I think that's pretty telling. versus your opponent who's getting a lot of the conservative and Republican ones. So at the end of the day, it matters if voters know that or not. I think a lot of us who pay attention really closely know that, but the question is like, has that been communicated broadly? I haven't seen any ads saying, you know, Kelly's endorsed by Republicans or Johnston's endorsed by ultra left liberals or anything like that. So it doesn't seem like anybody's operationalizing that information. But, you know, if anybody knows about it and they're making their decisions based on what Steve said, that this is the party of Trump, this is the party of overturning Brough, this is the party of holding the economy hostage for spending cuts, that's probably not a great look for a Denver mayoral candidate.
Can I say, Ian, Advancing Denver, the independent expenditure, the PAC that's supporting Mike Johnston went up with a new ad today. That's a positive ad on that. It features his endorsement from Calderon and Leslie Herod and from a whole bunch of unions, and it's got everyone jumping up like a Toyota commercial at the end. And that's going to be getting heavy airplay like the Johnston IE ads have been previously. So that's going to be at least drawing those lines.
I say it's pretty smart. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the endorsement, watching the endorsements has been interesting. I think it's a kind of a mixed bag, and you can pick out what you want. I don't think anybody would accuse Wellington Webb of being a Republican or Bill Ritter of being a Republican. They're both Kelly supporters. You know, the mayor, Mayor Hancock, got the endorsement of the police union in 2019. We were happy to have it, because if you are a mayor, you have to work with the police union. You have collective bargaining agreements that you have to negotiate. So I think you can pick and choose what you want. I thought the endorsement from Lisa Calderon was probably helpful for Mike Johnston, but I thought it was a strange endorsement in the sense that Mike was not there. And I think Calderon probably did him a favor by not insisting that he be physically with her during that endorsement. It's kind of a mixed bag. I actually think that Denver voters are more pragmatic than looking at endorsements. And I also think that they will look past the kind of progressive lens. I think it would be fairer to both candidates if they did so, because if you know Mike Johnston, you know he worked with Republicans and was known as a pretty, you know, centrist legislator in the Senate. And if you know Kelly Brough, you know she was a progressive leader of the chamber, probably the most progressive, liberal-leaning leader of the chamber in modern memory. So I think it's in some ways unfair to both candidates to label them this way, but I totally understand why the politics may favor Mike in the sense that there's a view that he's more progressive than Kelly. I think if you look deeply, you're going to find two human beings that are very basically pragmatic politicians, and they'll approach the job that way. And these endorsements aren't going to mean a whole lot afterwards. I think promises made to who is going to be part of the transition could be problematic with the candidates, and I think that's another piece of this that could be a hangover post-election if you've made promises that you are going to be uncomfortable keeping, and that's true for both candidates.
And there had been some pretty big promises made by by both campaigns. But Mike, I want to go to you just really quickly along the lines of what Ernest asked, but I want to ask like a more specific follow-up question. Obviously, it's a nonpartisan election. I do wonder from your end if you think this election will be decided along traditional, ideological, essentially partisan lines, or if you think that voters are asking different questions than they are in explicitly partisan races, if you will.
Right. I'll take a run at that, Luigi. I would say the first part of my reaction is, first of all, most of the voters in the general election were older, not younger. I would think that would incline more toward Kelly's benefit if sort of the view is that Mike is doing better with progressives. I'm just throwing out sort of a couple general observations about that. If you add Kelly's vote with Mike's vote, with Andy Rougeau's vote, if those three kind of represent the centrist track, and you could throw in Chris Hansen at just about 5%, that brings you into the 56-60% range. So then everybody else, all those other candidates, top of which would be Calderon, split the difference there. And if it just seems to me, if that trend continues on, while my sense is that Mike is doing better with progressives, I don't know that that will be costly in the end for Kelly if older voters are coming out. Another thing along those lines, the DSA slate of council candidates really got brushed back. You had a couple that worked through on the at-large races, but Sita Baca didn't win outright, and some of the other DSA candidates that were strong, effective candidates, well-funded, certainly didn't make it. So I look at it and I think dynamically, it just suggests to me that older voters are really engaged in general, younger voters are less engaged in general. And whereas I think Mike is doing better with progressives, it appears to me that Kelly might be doing better with older, kind of more quote establishment voters. So that's why I do think it's going to wind up being sort of a horse race all the way to the end.
I mean, it is worth noting that at this point in the race, this runoff versus the general, turnout is currently up among both younger voters and Democrats, whereas compared to where it was at this point in the general. I'm looking at the results right now on this Tableau site. So, I mean, yeah, Mike, that makes sense. But right now, the reality of the math is that the projections show Democrats are actually voting in larger numbers than they did then at this point in the first round, and then as well as younger voters, which is actually kind of surprising. I assumed it would be the other way around, but looking at the numbers, they're turning out right now. And I think that has to do with the fact that Councilwoman Sita Baca is in a race still, and her base is probably turning out in that district. You have a couple other fights where the progressives are still hanging on and fighting for their top ticket. So I think all those things will probably come to fruition. And you also have to remember that if Democrats and younger voters who traditionally vote later are voting faster, more, and earlier, the chances that trend continues for the next 6 days goes up too.
Yeah, and I'll just come back to the Republican thing. I might be the only Republican on the panel here, except for Alan. I know
You're a representative proportional sample.
Alan's a big Republican. It's an interesting gambit. I've run for office. It's really, it's probably not the kind of endorsement that would be helpful. On the other hand, I found it fascinating that Andy Rougeau went out and got almost 12% of the vote. He must have, I didn't see any exit polling, so I don't know who exactly voted, but I would imagine any Republican that cast their vote must have voted for Andy. So if Republicans are active on behalf of Kelly, but she doesn't have to own any of the baggage, which is all fair game, which you've all mentioned earlier, I think that's another not insignificant dynamic here.
Yeah, and just to DSA, by the way, is the Democratic Socialist of America, describes itself as the largest socialist organization in the country, of course. And talking about Andy Rougeau, just really quickly, if I'm remembering this correctly, and Ernest probably has a better memory on this one, I think he outperformed his party's registration numbers in the municipal election. But go ahead, Ernest.
I was going to say, yeah, he did. Rougeau got about, like Mike was saying, 12% of the vote. The Republican registration is about 10% of Denver's electorate. But as you know, in any city with a predominantly one partisan lean or the other, there's going to be a lot of unaffiliateds who are all but Republican, and they just aren't registered Republican. As a matter of comparison, Joe Biden beat Donald Trump within Denver's boundaries by about 4-1. So it was about 80% to 20%. So that's about, seems to be about the ceiling for the Republican / right-leaning vote in Denver.
And I think, Ernest, you have a question about potential missteps.
I do. There it is. And let's go around and let's start with Alan here. Y'all are experienced politicos. You've run plenty of campaigns, both as managers or as candidates, in Mike's case. What mistakes do you think either of these candidates have made up to this point? And I'm curious if you noticed any missed opportunities in the first round or the runoff. Alan, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's tough, Ernest. I don't want to criticize either one of them because I got to turn over the keys to one of them. I would rather focus on maybe some missed opportunities. I think it would have been interesting to see right after the initial first round if Kelly, for example, had enough resources and money to overcome some of the. She didn't really get a lot of credit for coming in second because she had to wait a couple of days for that Calderon dynamic to play out. So if there'd been resources and money to put up an immediate ad, I think it would have been helpful. But to Steve's point, you don't save money on the theory that you're going to be in the second round. You put it all on the first round to make sure you get there. So a missed opportunity for her potentially. I think a missed opportunity for Mike. Boy, I have to stretch on this one because I'm not sure that I've seen that he's missed opportunities. The real goal here, I think, for both of these candidates is to overcome whatever messages and promises they've made so that there is a realistic set with voters come July 17th when one of them takes office. And the real opportunity is what happens then when they set the tone for what they promised and set the mood for what voters can expect to see take place in the next 6 months. On balance, though, Ernest, I think both campaigns have been pretty good at what they've done. You haven't seen a serious misstep like Jamie Gillis in 2019, who ludicrously couldn't remember the name of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that was just a big mistake. I don't think I've seen that in this. The only drama that I've seen was probably the drama around Leslie Herrod's endorsement, and that kicked up for about 24 hours. But I haven't seen real missteps. But I'll leave it to the other political experts.
Any of you others, what are your takes about how these campaigns have been run? And like Alan says, what voters have had a chance to see from these candidates?
Well, from my take, Ernest, if you're the woman candidate in a two-person race, you're the de facto winner. It's certainly worth 5 to 8 points, maybe more in Denver. And I would have tried to take advantage of that more than it seems to me that Kelly's campaign has. Again, Alan and I chatted about this a while ago. She had a very strong bio ad. She has a strong bio personally, and running more of that, kind of connecting with people on a personal level is a little tougher for her, it seems to me, and putting that on the air made more sense. We all understood that she was down in the polls early because she's the one who drew first blood, right? But when you draw first blood and you're complaining about your opponent being a member of the Skull and Bones at Yale, they were ready for that. They popped her back on the Chamber of Commerce, and so it all became neutral. That's not how you want to come out of the gate swinging, I don't think, on something that's not particularly substantive. So on the one hand, you've got a corporate candidate against an elitist candidate, right? So if Denver voters have to choose between a corporate and elitist, I think they're going to make that call. So for me, I would have tried to warm Kelly up a bit more and make her a little bit more personable, run that bio spot a whole lot more, and maybe piece that together and run as a woman in a little more visceral way, a little more strategic way, I suspect.
Mike.
Yeah, I would, you have to sort of strain yourself to identify big mistakes. But one thing I've noticed, and maybe I'm a little more tuned up to this because I've been a candidate in the past, it's difficult to attack people that you more or less like. And I think they do more or less like one another. It always gets difficult, as you get into these races, but it's just uncomfortable if that's not your nature. And I've sort of marveled that, this is a really big, really important election. They both obviously have a lot into it. I thought they both should have been drawing sharper contrasts. It's uncomfortable to do. It's hard to do it in sort of a winsome way, but and I tend to agree with Steve that, well, you didn't exactly say this, Steve, but I think that approach probably is generally easier for Kelly to do than Mike to do. Just because the way our politics work on those matters. But she's been very, very deferential, very, pretty magnanimous, actually. And Mike has too, generally. I think they both want to win, and they're both competitors. I'm a little surprised they haven't sharpened it up a little bit more.
I'm gonna say, but both of their independent expenditure committees have not been shy about going after their candidate's opponent with some pretty hard-hitting ads from the Brough folks. And
that's kind of what you want, right? Like you don't want to be the one like throwing punches at people who you either like, to Mike's point, or are widely considered somewhat similar to you, right? Like there's no real margin in that. This didn't get personal, which I thought was nice. But I also think that there are missed opportunities, and there were mistakes that were made. For the life of me, I don't understand why Brough's campaign would attack Leslie Herod in the last week or whatever. That's like a swing and a miss in a major way. You want to attack your opponent if you're going to be doing any swinging, not like a surrogate or an endorser or someone like that. So I thought that was an odd choice. That article came out, what was that, late last week or earlier this week? It's all kind of a blur, where it was like, okay, if you're going to go after them, go after your opponent. Don't go after some endorser and then like give them the opportunity to back off and everybody else to come in and hit you back. I didn't understand that move on the board. That's not one I would have made.
What about the Johnston campaign? Someone who's been elected several times by a lot of the voters who will be voting in this. He's run prominent statewide campaigns, came in third in one of them, dropped out early in the other. But what's he done? I mean, should he have put this away? Why?
I don't know. Democratic voters
Why
don't
are
really
people still saying that this could be going down to the wire?
I don't think it will, for the record. Like I think this is going to be pretty decisive, and the first round we'll know pretty early next Tuesday who won this thing, and I have my bet. But I don't know. I think it's proven science that Democratic voters don't respond very well to negativity. Independent voters do, Republicans do. Maybe both of these campaigns made that calculation. And, if I'm Johnston and I think I'm ahead, there's no reason to punch down and create a controversy if you think the wind's at your back. If you're Brough and it doesn't seem like she has the resources to both introduce herself and boost her name ID and take a whack at Johnston. So I think she's probably hoping her IE is going to do that work, which they're doing some of. But at this point, I think Johnston's IE is 4-1 in terms of cash raised and spent. So at that point, you're just getting drowned out. There's not a lot you can do about it.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask one real quick follow-up, go around, maybe start with Alan? A municipal election is different here. And you've seen that after the last one. You can't make too many enemies, because you gotta, come July 17th, you gotta sit down and work with all these folks. And you're stuck doing that for the next 4 years. Does that explain some of why they're all taking maybe a more deferential and friendlier kind of, competition for the best ideas, rather than, my opponent is the worst thing you've ever seen?
Yeah, Ernest, you just said more eloquently what I was trying to express earlier. I think but you have two candidates who are temperamentally that way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder what the race might have been like if Dr. Calderon had come in second, for example. Very different race. Question then is, would it have been more contentious? Would Johnson have put it away sooner? I don't know. It's all speculation. But I think the temperament of both of these people, and I know them well, is that they're not really gut fighters. They are collaborative people. And I think there is a recognition that what they say in the campaign or promises they make in the campaign, they're going to have to live with. And to Steve's point, 100 days, people are going to look around and say, wow, have things changed? And I don't believe things will change dramatically, which is why these candidates have to set an expectation that doesn't disappoint voters. I think the problems are such that they're not going to be resolved in 100 days or even in the first 6 months of the administration. But I think both people are very experienced politicians. As Kelly would say, she's not a politician, but she's certainly very politically savvy. And I think they both know that they're going to have to live with their promises, and at the end of the day, they'll be judged by how they govern.
Alan, sorry, you're saying that we're not going to solve homelessness, this perception of crime in downtown Denver, and in 100 days. Is that what you're saying?
Well, if it were doable, Luigi, I would say we would have done it. God knows it's been the centerpiece of my daily life for the last 2 years out of COVID. So God bless whoever wins. I hope that they can make more progress than we have, but I expect that they're going to use the tools that we have and either expand on them or make the incremental progress that I think you're seeing around the country with cities.
Can I just say one more thing about the negativity or positivity of the campaign? I just thought of this while we were talking. Like, it is kind of interesting. Voters say they hate negative campaigns, right? These two candidates are pretty pragmatic, normal people. Neither one of them's a knife fighter. Like, that's a good way to put it, Alan. And they're having a campaign about the ideas, right? They're talking about what they want to do, how they want to do it, who they are, why they want to run for mayor, why they want to be mayor. And they're like, yeah, there's some like press here and there, and there's the IEs doing what IEs do, but like, it is kind of good that they haven't like turned into a scorched earth nightmare level like negativity fest. I mean, there's 6 days left. It could happen. I don't think so. If it would have happened, it would have happened already. So you can let that stuff burn in a little bit. So this is kind of the campaign that voters say they want. They want a campaign on the ideas. They want a campaign that's not negative or personal, and they're getting it. So I don't know. I'm not sure we've seen this before. Even in Colorado Springs, they turned on Yemi Mobolade, the mayor-elect down there, and called him all sorts of nonsense socialist stuff that doesn't fit the guy if you even listen to him talk once in your life. But this campaign, comparatively, despite the fact that like lots of experienced Democratic operatives who have thrown plenty of punches that have connected in their time are involved on both sides of this thing. The fact that it stayed pretty upbeat, issues focused and positive is something to, I think, A, of all be proud of, and B, just like register as interesting.
Let me ask you, I think this is a good segue to talk about the independent expenditure that we're seeing. As far as I can tell, it's massive spending by the super PACs supporting these two candidates. Last time I checked, it was 5.5 million. I think 4.2 million of that is supporting Mike Johnston, 1.3 million supporting Kelly Brough. And both candidates' IEs have gotten, major significant money from wealthy donors who, for example, don't live in Denver. Reid Hoffman and Mike Bloomberg for Johnston, Pete Course, we mentioned that for Brough. I guess the question is, why are these funders pouring money into Denver's race for mayor? Let me start with Mike on that one.
Well, thanks, Luigi.
And Mike's members.
Actually, a little known fact, not to get into somebody's personal life, Pete Course is associated with Golden, and we all know that. Also a resident of Denver, has been for a few years now. I think Pete is, I won't speak for Pete. I think he's really concerned about the direction of his city, as he's entitled to be. If the question is the question sort of what's in it for the backers? Is that where you're
what do they hope to gain? I'm looking at Michael Bloomberg, for example, and I'm thinking, well, why is he spending money in a Denver mayor's race? Is it an investment for the future? Is Mike Johnson's going to run for the U.S. Senate at some point? I mean, why is he spending $500,000 in this race?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. I suppose it could be any number of things. I mean, the simplest explanation is they have a relationship. They know one another. He supports him. He believes in him. It's not unusual to have it stands out because it's a lot of money, but it's not unusual for a candidate to run in Ohio, and her family back in Illinois is rallying up all their friends to send them money, and then their opponent says, aha, they've got all this outside money coming from Illinois, where there's a perfectly rational reason for that. It could be as simple as that, Luigi. There may be other things downstream that I can't speak to. Don't know.
Steve, what do you think?
Well, yeah, there's big money on both sides. Some of it's bigger denominations for one than the other, but there's still, big corporate interests, big moneyed interests in both campaigns. The real mistake we make is that all the good government people who want to have campaign finance regulations get it wrong. We keep pushing down the amount of money you can raise in a race, $500 is ludicrous. And so guess what? Money's going to find a way to be involved in a campaign. And if some of us in the room remember back to when Marvin Davis endorsed Federico Pena, right? Big banner headlines. Marvin Davis gives Pena a bunch of money. That's what you want, right? You want to know where the money's coming from. You want to have transparency. You want to have immediate disclosure. And if we had more of that, we'd be better off. Instead, we have these silly campaign finance rules that forces money to go other places. And the candidates don't have the kind of control over that they'd like to have. And we're left kind of trying to figure out the question you just answered, which is not the question we ought to be talking about. So I get a little cranky about campaign finance. We say we want it, but the truth is we end up with a worse model when we're done. And Ernest pointed out a new ad by Johnston, new ad by Kelly I just saw this morning as well, that puts Hoffman and Bloomberg on TV. Says, here's the big money guys, and they're trying to buy the race. Voters talk about campaign finance. Voters never, ever vote on campaign finance. Nobody ever cares where the money came from. All they want to know is the last ad they saw, the last mailer they read. That's what they're going to respond to. So again, another missed shot by Kelly Brough.
And this might be a good segue to talk about the Fair Elections Fund, because I know Ernest has a question about that.
I do, but and I would like to hear too from Alan and Ian about what they think about this massive outside spending while we're talking about this. But like Steve said, we've had a chance to see the Fair Election Fund in action for the first time. I'm curious what y'all think. Did it work? Can it be fixed? What do we look at going forward? Let's go to Ian.
All right, Alan, you tell me. $8 million that could have been used for anything else, going instead to the pockets of schmucks and consultants like me, doesn't seem like a good use of taxpayer dollars. I was sort of like public financing curious before this election. I was like, yeah, it makes sense. Maybe it'll like bring up some other ideas or give some other candidates a platform that wouldn't have had otherwise. I think this is a proof that is an abject failure. $8 million getting set on fire for candidates who, I mean, Kelly Brough got the max at $750K. Mike Johnston almost there at $613K. Jim Walsh got $51,000. Ian Tafoya got $150,000. I don't think, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think any of that money created any new conversations about any new issues that weren't going to happen anyway otherwise, right? That was the stated goal of the Fair Election Fund. It's to give candidates who would have been drowned out or wouldn't have had the opportunity to speak up and run resources to do that. The conversation is the same. It's crime, homelessness, climate, and who's progressive and who's conservative and what kind of that's where the conversation would have been otherwise. So I think this is like a demonstrated failure of this Fair Election Fund. Maybe there's a way to reconstitute it and make it better. I don't think this worked at all. And I think that money would be better spent serving people experiencing homelessness or feeding hungry people or doing almost literally anything else. And I agree with Steve that so much of these well-intentioned campaign finance laws have exactly the opposite effect. So when you're asking me, Ernest, about, the IEs and who's funding them, man alive, get used to it. IEs play in every single race on every single side. They have since Citizens United, and they've only gotten bigger and badder. They will continue to. And a guy like Reid Hoffman, putting money into Mike Johnston, what does he want us to rename a neighborhood LinkedIn? I don't think he wants anything other than he's supporting a guy who he agrees with. Same thing with Bloomberg. Same thing with the Coors family, right? They probably have a relationship with Kelly. They're boosting her independent expenditure committee for the same reasons. And it is what it is. There's, when you reduce the amount of money that candidates can raise and spend on their own, you increase the megaphone that these independent expenditure committees can have, and this is the result of it. So I am now firmly opposed to at least this iteration of the Fair Elections Fund and think it needs to be reformed completely or eliminated.
What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, I might use different language than Steve and Ian, but I think they make a good point. Interestingly enough, when COVID hit, and the city faced a significant financial crisis on top of everything else, the mayor wanted to, put the fair election funds into helping the city with what we thought would be a significant deficit problem or fiscal problem. And he encountered resistance from city council. They wanted that fund to be in place. even in the midst of what was a fiscal challenge post-COVID. So I thought that was interesting. I think look, there are better ways to spend the money, and that's where I land.
Yeah, Mike, what are your thoughts on the Fair Election Fund?
Yeah,
Pay some attention to it, or
a little bit. I have to say, just as a personal matter, I'm pretty unenthusiastic about it for most or all of the reasons that have been mentioned. But also, I think you're running for a political office. If you cannot go out and convince people that it'd be a good idea to put you in political office, and they ought to give you some traveling money so you can go produce a message. I mean, it almost speaks for itself. Maybe you're not as articulate as you think you are, and it sounds a little bit harsh, but I guess I take an old school view about it. When people go run for office, there's too many stories in American history to cite that hard scrabble people come from nowhere and they win races regularly. And actually, I think it makes them stronger elected officials when they have to break through that way. So that's my point. And yeah, I'm with Ian on this. I'd put the money toward another big problem. I don't think the money was supposed to. I don't think if it, I hope the program will be evaluated in light of what its goals were. Because if the goals were not put more money into the accounts of the top two candidates who were going to raise a lot of money, then they certainly should, at a minimum, reevaluate it.
One other quick question here, just kind of about the process, although I think Steve's point is very much on point, that voters often don't care about these kind of questions that consume politicos and consultants and even journalists. Some things like campaign finance questions and redistricting and things like that can chew up a lot of oxygen don't tend to matter a lot when the voters time to turn things in. But one thing that has come up in this race several times, should Denver move the municipal election to November? Both candidates have expressed some support for at least considering that. But I say, because it's a general election and a runoff, the timing on that can get really, really dicey. You'd have to hold the general either in August, or if the November election was the general, the runoff would be in January. And neither of those things seem to address what we're looking at. So can we go around quickly, because we're approaching the end, but let's say first with Alan, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, Ernest, the clerk and recorder, Paul Lopez, actually convened a group to discuss this, and there are pros and cons on the November versus May. Arguments for May are it sets Denver's issues apart from the national conversation. It also gives a focus to Denver that would get potentially lost if you have a November election filled with presidential ads and Senate ads, U.S. Senate ads, and it loses some focus. I think that's the main reason why it's helpful to have an election that is separate from November. But there are arguments of efficiency. There are arguments about a longer ballot. The ballot is already pretty long, so you can imagine what it would look like if you added a bunch of federal offices at the same time. So I think on balance, we've got it right in Denver. And who wouldn't want an election, when the sun is shining and there's plenty of time to contemplate the ads and mailing. I just think we've got it right, but there are arguments on the other side for sure. But I think we resolved it with this commission. Maybe the next mayor will convene another commission.
Okay, Steve, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Alan. I would just add that there's a lot of discussion as well about ranked choice voting.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine a worse idea for Denver. I mean, the whole process we had in the first round of the general, 16 candidates, that's your ranked choice voting right there. You need to have a race between two people to have that kind of distinction about who should be the mayor. Not just for this cycle. This cycle is a little more of a kind of agreement But in a lot of cycles, you need to have that black-white differentiation. You don't get that with ranked choice voting. I think that's just a bad idea moving forward
Okay.
for Denver.
Mike, what do you?
Yeah, I've never been entirely clear on what problem we're trying to solve by moving it.
Mike, you got muted, sir.
Thank you. I guess I've never had a problem with where it is now, mostly because I'm not entirely clear what problem we're trying to solve. And, you know, my own, I'm not really opposed to it on the other hand, but my own view is that, you know, anytime you make public policy changes, especially big ones like this, there's always pros and cons, always consequences. So unless, as I say, unless there's, you know, some urgent need to move it, which I've not seen yet, I'd say leave it alone.
Okay, Ian.
Yeah, I'm gonna go in a big circle here and like maybe disagree with everybody. So moving the election wouldn't put, I agree with Alan, I wouldn't put it in an even year up against a midterm or a presidential. It'll get drowned out. It'll be really confusing to voter to have partisan elections on one side and a nonpartisan election in the middle of it. If you were to also then throw in ranked choice voting, that would be an absolute disaster. And like our vaunted mail ballot system would quickly become like incredibly confusing and unusable. So I agree you should keep them separate. I do think you should move it to November of the odd year though, for a couple of reasons. One, you get more separation from the presidential election or the midterm that just occurred. People are fatigued after November of an even year and nobody really started paying attention to this one. It was 4 months later. Right, it was April, like early April of, or 5 months, I guess, of this year. That is not enough distance from like a knockdown, drag out killer election. So I think you give people more time to campaign, more time to get into the race, more time to run, raise money, make their cases, let voters get to know them, and you have it in fall of the odd year following the midterm. I think that would be an improvement. I think it would improve voter turnout. I think it would improve participation. I think it would give candidates more time to find their stride, make their arguments, and, you know, amass their support financially and with voters and endorsers. When it comes to ranked choice voting, I've seen it work now in real life a few times. I do some work up in Alaska, and we watched that process work itself out 3 times in a row recently, and it was really successful. Voters love it. It's not confusing. They do a ranked choice voting with instant runoff. So Mary Peltola ended up winning that congressional special, and then again won the general election last November. When it works, it works. They had mail ballots too, just like us, and people really liked it. It took some education, but it increased voter turnout. It led to what I think a lot of people want. Maybe I'm not necessarily in this camp, but it moderated the electorate, and it actually produced the most centrist, moderate candidate from a milieu of more extremes on both sides. And I think for a race like this, Steve said, you know, the runoff is the ranked choice voting, and then you have the general's ranked choice voting of the runoff. Okay, that's a fair argument. But if you were able to just have one election in November where everybody had to run the entire time, make their case, and then you had the ranked choice voting instant runoff, that might improve the process too. So if I were to wave a magic wand, that's what I would design for the city I don't even live in.
Let's go to some of the questions from the audience. Here's one. With the intense focus on essentially 3 issues, and that would be public safety, you know, homelessness, housing. Aren't Denver voters in the dark about how either candidate will govern on a constellation of other subjects? Let me ask Alan that question.
Yeah, it's a really insightful question, and I think I share the frustration that behind the question. I don't think we've done a good enough job in the administration now to explain what the city's up to. And I think there are a lot of things going on. For example, concern about not having enough police. We're right now with the 2 recruit classes that we have in place, we're about at 92% of force strength with police. So we've made some real strides in that area. Haven't seen a story about that, but it's hard to put some of this into the media and get coverage. So frankly, campaigns are superficial in some ways. You don't get very much depth. You get sound bites and you get vision and you get promises, but the real depth of the work, it's hard. And in some ways, I suppose it might be boring, but that's the whole point of governance. I'm drawn to politics, not because I love the game of politics, although I kind of do. The draw to me is what you do with it in the public policy arena. So I think we could certainly look at this race and think that we might have done better to push the candidates to explain the details of their programs. I think that's just the nature of the way things work these days in politics, but we can improve it.
Thank you, Alan. Here's the question. I think Steve might be best positioned to answer this. What role an affiliated voters might play in this race, since they were pretty decisive in the election in Colorado Springs?
So, I mean, unaffiliated voters are always a big part of the race, but in Denver County, they make up a smaller portion than they would statewide, for example. So not quite the same dynamic. Plus, it's not a partisan race in the classic sense. It's a Democratic primary, and so in that sense, it's a different kind of race. You're really talking about neighborhood issues, parks, policing. You're getting down into that kind of nitty gritty, and less on party labels, in my view.
Thank you, Steve. A final question, maybe Mike or Ian, is the civility that you're seeing in this race because Denver voters generally do not like campaigns going negative, or is it because the campaigns think that voters are fed up with high partisan, attacks in campaigns? Let's go with Mike.
Oh, I'll just take a quick run at it. I think Ian said something very insightful, several things insightful, but one of them was that these candidates are running the races that they believe the voters want them to run in many respects. And I think it is refreshing for everybody. I spoke to drawing contrasts, not to burning it down. And I do think people are pretty worn out with all the negativity. So I think they're probably reading the electorate properly.
Ian, just really quickly, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. The reason why you do negative campaigning is because it works. And if you are running a sophisticated race with both of these candidates and you go out and you say, hey, if you knew this about your opponent, would you be more or less likely to vote for them? Maybe the attacks fell flat. Maybe one campaign thinks they're far enough ahead, they don't need to throw punches and they want to end on a high note. That's all fine. At the end of the day, you have to win. That's the only thing that matters in these campaigns, right? And if one campaign or the other thought that going hard, scorched earth negative was going to win them the race, they probably would have done it. I think there's some altruism and some ethics and some moral center going on here, but I also know professionals are running all sides of these campaigns. And if they thought throwing one or two haymakers was going to do it, they probably would have done it.
And with that, I want to thank all the panelists for spending an hour with us, to our audience, to our listeners. Thank you for joining us as well. Ian, thank you again. Alan, thank you. Steve, thank you. Mike, thank you. Ernest, thank you. And of course, Vince, thank you again for taking the time. And with that, I would say, hey, don't mail your ballots at this point. The time to do mail your ballot was yesterday, so you still have your ballot, and there's a lot of you I know. Go to a voting center or just vote in person on election day. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Good to see you all.
Thanks, y'all.
Appreciate it. Good discussion.